heard you question my stability. You think I'll fall just like a guillotine.
I was told he was dead.
I'm here to stay.
I don't believe it.
The storm is coming, so you better start running.
Does the mafia boss know where my brother is?
Control, feel it in my bones. I'm coming for the, coming for the. I'm coming for the throne.
A cab driver noticed that his passenger had a little too much to drink. Did he want to relax after a hard night out? But the man noted to himself that he was terribly dizzy. But there was no way he could pass out now. His eyes were swimming with images. God, it was so hard. And then his head rested against the door. And the cab driver had already thought of something. The car stopped at an abandoned building, and the man had an accomplice. They wanted to assess the girl's figure. The temptation was so great that when she woke up, they did not resist. The main thing was that the girl should not twitch. The men wanted, though, were sure they would have a great time. The stranger suggested they stop there. What did she mumble? Stop. Girls like that usually screamed the loudest. Well, then there was no time to lose. Except she didn't agree. The main character warned me. Luckily, the police arrived. And the girl, whose clothes were stained with blood, happily greeted the lieutenant. He knew it would end like this. Everyone knew her as Sergeant Hana Lee. She was the best counter-terrorist agent. Before joining PMC, the girl had worked in the Special Forces unit. She hadn't failed a single mission. One could only imagine how tough Hana Lee was. She also had a brother who worked in intelligence. That kind of kinship makes her even cooler. What a family. But what was that girl doing in Korea? What such a legend really joined them? The two men's conversation was interrupted by the shouts of the lieutenant, who forbade the girl to disarm anyone in the worst possible way. But these criminals were far from being at their best. Hana Lee, on the other hand, blamed it on self-defense on pure reflexes. Although she might have overdone it, the girl dumped all the evidence and explained that the men threatened her with a cold weapon. So it could be considered attempted murder with robbery. If you also record the condition of the heroine, then you can add intimidation on top. She was covered in blood from head to toe. Suddenly, the girl ordered the lieutenant to undress. Why did she need his clothes? But the man couldn't let her hang around like that, could he? Actually, he should have offered it to her himself. Good job. If it wasn't for Hana Lee, the criminals would have gotten away with it. But praise is worthless. The lieutenant should have repaid the favor, and she was really experienced. The man got a promotion when these two are behind bars. He didn't have a choice. Besides, her involvement in this operation had to be kept secret. The lieutenant asked her how Dewey Lee was doing. The guy was traveling now. Spent 2 months in the States, then went to Spain. I think he was going to Cambodia. He'd been sent on a real mission. He was really smart. Suddenly, the girl got a call. It was Cambodia's number. Someone on the other side said hello to Mr. Dewey Lee's sister. The person was calling from National Security and Intelligence. What did they talk about? Her brother was killed in the last operation, and darkness fell. Hana Lee had been talking for far too long. Even the lieutenant was getting tired of waiting, but now she'd moved on to yelling and insults. Really, the girl was afraid it would turn out to be true. It didn't make any sense. A shiver ran through her body. How could this happen to Dewey Lee? She couldn't believe it. Her body gave up and collapsed on the cold ground. Tears began to wash away the blood on her face, and a co-worker ran up and grabbed Hana Lee by the shoulders. It was as if she was stunned and blinded at the same time. It must be just a nightmare. That baby whimpering could be heard even in the night. A little boy sobbing because his fault, his big sister had taken him away. She just wanted to protect him. Dewey Lee didn't do anything wrong back then. His body always reacted badly to food. It was only wrong of the head mistress to make him eat it. Dewey Lee took his sister's hand and promised that when he grew up, he would make sure that no one would ever hurt Hana Lee again. The boy made a promise to protect her. So all she had to do was wait. The main character woke up from this long nightmare. Dewey Lee was the only reason why the girl returned to Korea. Suddenly, her attention fell on a sound. Where was that noise coming from? It seemed to be coming from downstairs. Under the bed. Hana Lee discovered a secret passage that contained a phone. It was Dewey Lee calling. What's going on? The signal was too weak, and the call could be dropped at any second. The girl asked for his location, but the younger brother only replied that Renti was dangerous. She had to do something. Hana Lee tried to track his location, but the sound disappeared. Dewey Lee's cough disappeared, and there was calm. The agency said he was dead, but the brother was still alive. He was most likely calling her from a device that couldn't be traced or tapped, which means Dewey Lee was cornered. Hana Lee promptly made the decision to go to Cambodia. Otherwise, she might have lost Dewey Lee forever. On the island of Sicily in Italy, a certain man discovered that his goods had been stolen. It was Giulio Parenti, the Sicilian mafia head, who was responsible for him. As it turned out, it was Niccolo, who was immobilized on the spot. Giulio Parenti couldn't leave it like that, could he? The man gave the order to start packing because they're moving out. There's a good chance they were already waiting for them in Cambodia. A certain someone expressed words of regret to Hana Lee, saying that he should have taken better care of Dewey Lee. The girl, on the other hand, asked Tae-jun to stop crying and instead answer her. Where was her little brother's body located? Unfortunately, the man didn't know and couldn't even find it. The reason was because a bomb had exploded there. Apparently, Dewey Lee had stolen something that belonged to the mafia. They tried to kill him by sending a suicide bomber with a bomb. This must be a joke. Hana Lee instructed Tae-jun to wait for her at the airport because she was going to find the body herself. More accurately, she was going to find her brother alive. It was terribly hot in Cambodia. Tae-jun didn't show up, even though he had promised to drop by the office for just 1 minute. Here he comes. The shaggy-haired man called a tuk-tuk. He was Dewey Lee's closest colleague, and an employee of the National Security and Intelligence Service. When the girl peppered him with questions about his car and job, Tae-jun quickly changed the subject. It seems that Hana Lee suspected something after all. She wanted the coordinates of the place where Dewey Lee was last seen. Why, it was 75 kilometers north of here. Some village, except a man tried to talk Hana Lee out of it. If the intelligence people found out about it, it wouldn't end well for her. She did not care, because the protagonist translated the conversation and asked the calculation of information about the activities of her younger brother. She wished to know the purpose of the last operation, who Dewey Lee had interacted with, what clothes and shoes he was wearing. She was curious about when the bomb exploded and Dewey Lee's means of transportation. In a word, everything. Now that Hana Lee was threatening him. Well, Tae-jun did not confront her, but that was the last time he would help her. In Dewey Lee's apartment, the girl looked around carefully. Everything was cleaned up, bottles arranged neatly in rows. But no matter how much she thought about it, she couldn't imagine her younger brother dying like this. Dewey Lee and Tae-jun were tracking new types of illegal substances. They were trying to track down the Italian mafia that was distributing them. At one point, the guy lost contact with Dewey Lee right before they were supposed to meet at the location where the illegal substances were stored. Tae-jun went to see what was going on. It looked like he was going to act on his own. But Tae-jun couldn't imagine that Dewey Lee was somehow involved with the mafia. The girl didn't know if she could trust those words. Perhaps Tae-jun had reported Hana Lee to his superiors long ago, and she should have stayed away from him from now on. But first, she had to get as much useful information as possible. Even in this house, Hana Lee knew to be careful how she behaved. For starters, it was possible to minimize the possibility of eavesdropping. Dewey Lee had always been obsessed with order. Whoever was here knew that for sure, but he had clearly missed the labels on the drinks, just like he had missed the hangers. Hana Lee needed to find something that her brother had left behind. There had to be something here. Could it be this? As it turned out, when the guys were talking about this hidden projector, instead of a lamp, it had a small projection device built into it. When turned on, it looked like a normal lamp. But if you pressed this button inside, when did Dewey Lee do this? After all, now Big Sister had no other choice. She didn't plan on contacting him again. The man was happy to talk to one again. So why had she dialed him? What was the reason? The man already knew that the protagonist was in Cambodia. But why? Was he following her? The girl asked him for a favor. Just a favor. find information on a man who had ties to the mafia, Giulio Parenti. Maybe she needed something else. Sure enough, the girl felt no shyness and asked for a weapon. Valentine's Day meant death. That's far from romantic. And that's where they met the first one. Everyone was happy to see Hana Lee, as was the head of Valentine's Day, Logan. The girl shared information with him regarding her brother and his assignment, except that she wasn't completely sure of its veracity, because Parenti wasn't the type to let live or take prisoners. There were a few other people here who might have had something to do with it, but one of them turned out to be Logan's client, so the man refused to say anything. Their conversation was interrupted by someone else. Eunseong Yoo? Eunseong Yoo is also excited to meet Hana Lee, and it was mutual. The man hoped to be useful during his stay in Cambodia. It's always nice to meet a fellow countryman. And if the guy really wanted to help her, the protagonist would gladly accept his offer. Taejoon was looking for Hana Lee. He couldn't even contact her. Could it be that something was wrong? The guy freaked out from not being allowed to hang around like that? This isn't a safe place. Hana Lee, on the other hand, ignored him and quickly rushed away because of the heat. He mumbled that if the girl needed to go somewhere, it would be best if she called him. Something could happen to her while she was alone. And he was right. The main character didn't know much, except that she was advising Taejoon to make the right decision. The information he gave her had so many gaps, especially the surveillance video. Didn't he himself think that something was wrong? With this scene that the video editor had captured, Dewey Lee entered the building where the bandits were, and then he was pulled back out before the bomb went off. Why would they shine their brother's face on camera if they were going to short him? Doesn't that sound like a staging? The intelligence service declared the guy dead just based on this video. And it's not even the original, it's an edited copy. Taejoon confessed. They found a body wearing a suicide vest. It was so mutilated that it was simply impossible to examine the body, except that Dewey Lee's military badge was on the body. That's why they assumed it was him. At that moment, Taejoon became Hana Lee's accomplice. She asked him to stop spying on her, and then the girl would pretend to believe the guy's words. She ordered him to tell his superiors that Hana Lee hadn't crossed the threshold of Dewey Lee's apartment since last night. Taejoon only remained silent. He couldn't even object. That's fine. It was Eunseong Yoo's turn. What a heartbreaking betrayal, except that it was too early to talk about it. They would wait and see how this story ended. Was Hana Lee really going to move out right now? Logan gave her the coordinates for the safe house. He said the Cambodian syndicate would probably head there, to lay low until further instructions. Giulio Parenti is going to show up. He's been robbed after all. Hana Lee decided to get to the scene before they did. They had the advantage, and the sly fox was quite confident. He only had one question for her. Did the girl have a lover? He was just curious. Unfortunately for him, yes, and he was right in front of Eunseong Yoo. Well, he'd have to back off before he got another scolding. The man hoped she would be okay. This was fun. What a pity. Another Valentine's hideout, where apparently the guys had been recently. They even had weapons ready for her. What had that asshole, Dewey Lee, gotten his big sister into? But it seems like everything was ready now. Couldn't he give her at least one more sign that he was alive? And so the days went by, and Logan kept wondering about the execution of the plan. So far, things had been quiet around here, and surprisingly, Hana Lee was relaxed. It's kinda weird. The girl wanted to ask him something. The question was regarding Eunseong Yoo. Was that guy really a gang member? He wasn't wearing a badge or anything that would let her know that he was one of them. Logan refused to comment on it in any way because Liu was a complicated guy. This was the first time Hana Lee had heard the name from him. Edward Liu, that's his American name. Logan assumed he had already arrived. The guy was definitely not as simple as he seemed. Didn't they teach him how to knock? Why had he even come here uninvited? The girl peppered him with questions, but his answers were somewhat childish. Eunseong Yoo thought that Hana Lee would be bored here, except he came here because he had a personal matter to her. The guy had some kind of mesa problem. This is a crime syndicate that Hana Lee should take a good look at and that ruled the entire country. It wasn't enough for them to just steal from the Sicilian mafia. They also had a man finish them off. What role did Eunseong Yoo play in all of this? And what did Logan mean when he said that? Lou interrupted the flow of her thought and told her not to be afraid because he wouldn't interrupt her. The girl would take over Giulio Parenti, and the man would take care of Mesa as planned. Everything was perfectly simple, but Hana Lee suddenly grabbed him by the collar and said that Eunseong Yoo was not a member of Valentine's Day. Who even said that? The guy said he would only help her. Or while Hana Lee was in Cambodia. Did she really forget? Who was he working for? Lou was about to confess, but they were interrupted by a phone call from Logan. Mesa was on its way. They'd be there in 3 hours. They numbered 40 men, and all were heavily armed. 1 trailer, 2 containers, and 6 trucks. Giulio Parenti was also aware of their movements and had already moved out after them. Will Hana Lee be able to handle it? And how did it all turn out like this? Just an hour ago, the protagonist couldn't have imagined how things would end. That's when they decided they couldn't fight them in the open. So they had to sneak into the trailer. To do this, Hana Lee was going to puncture the tires of the truck that would drive in front of it. Did the girl really want to delay the whole group until Parenti caught up with them? No. The first step would be to blow up the world when the Mesa showed up. The second step would be to sneak into the trailer while chaos ensues. And step 3 is to wait for Giulio Parenti to show up. The protagonist wanted to do everything as quietly as possible so as not to give herself away, which means she just needed to buy time to get into the trailer. Well, they had to try. Hana Lee seemed to like Eunseong Yoo a lot more than he thought. That sounded pretty old-fashioned. Get ready. Target number 1 was 3 minutes away from arriving. Target number 2 had been located. 5 crossovers 25 minutes away from target number 1. Giulio Parenti was with them. 1 minute to go. 20 seconds, 10 seconds, 5, and here they are. The car had hit a mine. There were people inside the trailer, and Hana Lee was in action. The first 4 targets didn't even have time to do anything, but 11 hours behind Hana Lee was the 5th. Lou got there just in time. How much he cared for his countrywoman. Target number 2 was 5 minutes away. They were traveling at a high speed, so Eunseong Yoo expected a collision. Were they really going to ram them? Who even steals goods without even checking them? Whose voice was that? The person was indignant because it belonged to someone very serious. It was Giulio Parenti. If the man had known everything in advance, he would never have signed up for this. The protagonist noticed that everything sounded as if the criminals didn't know who they were stealing from in the first place. A confrontation was inevitable. Unfortunately, Hana Lee was injured. She had prepared her weapon when the door opened. Her hand trembled under the weight of the gun, but the opponent wasn't afraid. He did not care. He was eagerly waiting for death to come for him. Except that the girl's attention had shifted to the man behind him. The gray-haired man asked what Giulio Parenti was going to do with her. He wondered if she would be of any use to him. Was that all? Hana Lee hugged herself bound to a chair, and she had good reflexes, as Giulio Parenti pointed out. The guy figured the girl was waiting for him inside the trailer on purpose. As it turned out, that was true. And before she was about to respond, Hana Lee asked him to take off his clothes. He didn't think the girl would stay in her things after her bath, did he? Her impertinent language infuriated her. Who said she was even going to get out of here alive? She wasn't flirting, was she? No way. Hana Lee was even willing to bet that she would be the one he would want in the end. But Giulio Parenti decided to speak differently. If this was what the girl really wanted, then she should have gotten used to this kind of thing sooner. Disagree? And he still didn't understand her. And then that man burst in. I demanded an explanation of what these two were doing here. I thought the mob head would finish with the girl as soon as possible. So why was he stalling? Giulio Parenti was sure that Hana Lee was going to hurt him. She had simply distracted him, and the man had unknowingly succumbed to the provocation. Again, that phrase had a hidden message which the man with the scarred face apologized for. What were they even talking about? The protagonist didn't really understand Italian, but by the feel of it, something strange was going on here, which meant she needed to get her hands free and fast. Anyway, the man asked to take care of everything himself. He promised to do it as carefully as possible, but Giulio Parenti forbade it. He was instructed to report yesterday's incident. Fortunately, Hana Lee was quicker. She was no longer the hostage. The mobs had noticed that they had screwed up a bit by tying the girl up. Except she would still get out. She needed to talk to him. Suddenly, the protagonist started hearing footsteps. She explained that nothing would be able to stop her until she managed to realize what she had planned. So the girl was looking for a meeting with him. It was part of her plan, and now everything was going the way she wanted it to. And what did Hana Lee want from Giulio Parenti? Help. If he did that, the girl would find whoever was pretending to be him. The cleanup team wondered what they should do with the bodies, and Eunseong Yoo pulled out a couple of bills and ordered them to dispose of them. It's just a bunch of criminals anyway. Giulio Ragnetti and his gang took the crate of weapons and the trailer of illegal substances. The last thing that needed to be taken care of now was Liu walked over to one of the bodies and pulled out his phone, unlocking it, and arrived later than Eunseong Yoo had expected. Taejun. The man hadn't seen him since the day Hana Lee gave him a good kicking. Hana Lee's co-worker seemed to be doing fine. And by the way, why didn't he say earlier that Hana Lee and Dui Lee were twins? It only became important now. Liu was demanding more information about his new acquaintance. As Taejun explained, the girl was just an ordinary civilian, nothing more. Dui Lee was her only living relative, so the girl can't accept his loss and even came here. Now the decision was up to Liu, so Taejun had to listen carefully. He needed to prove his usefulness as quickly as possible before they got rid of him. Was he really interested in her? Of course, Hana Lee is an attractive woman, which is why Eunseong Yoo wished to adjust his plans slightly. So the main character was going to catch that guy, pretending to be Giulio Parenti. It seems like it was a little late for that now. That guy from the Mesa had already met his end, except the girl's brother was keeping tabs on the imposter. So if the Mafia's head helps, they'll both find out who's behind it. Rumor had it that the man had given the order to attack a Korean intelligence agent, which just so happened to be Dui Lee. But would he be alive if that was the case? That was the reason why Hana Lee was standing here. She wanted to make sure Giulio Parenti hadn't destroyed him. The protagonist was counting on being able to get the attention of the head of the Mafia with this story. If she could convince him that she could be useful, then the goal would be accomplished. Except Giulio Parenti decided to play her game. That's what she wanted, wasn't it? The man suggested a little break, so Romano brought a glass of red and asked to let Lorenzo go. Did they really think Hana Lee would drink that? But Giulio Parenti began to talk about some distrust, because the initiative came from her side. They definitely put something in it. Except something told me that those guys didn't want Hana Lee dead. And she was right. The doctor should be here in 30 minutes, so the girl will get the proper treatment. Giulio Parenti ordered not to leave a single scratch on her body. There was darkness everywhere, but the girl couldn't just let it go. She had to remember this nightmare well. They would do to her what she had done to him, for all the pain he had to endure. The man will make sure that Hana Lee suffers as much as he did. Suddenly, the protagonist woke up. Covered in sweat, she looked around. Whose room is this? Hardly realized that she had been given sleeping pills. She had even had all her wounds treated. What a disgusting nightmare. How she wished she could erase those horrible memories from her mind. Going back to when Hana Lee was a Valentine's Day agent, there was one man who had gone to jail because of it. During his 7-month incarceration, gangsters hunted down and massacred his entire family. The man cursed the protagonist, promising revenge. Back then, her first reaction was a contemptuous smile. But time passed, and she became increasingly uncomfortable. When it was really bad, and the girl always ran to Dui Lee to make sure he was alright. Later, Hana Lee heard that the man was involved in some sort of showdown, after which he met his end. It was the first time a girl had ever rejoiced over someone's death. A horrible experience that made her feel that her humanity had given a slack. A moment of disappointment she didn't want to repeat. Now everything was normal, and she could stop thinking about it. Hana Lee would definitely save Dui Lee. That's what she should focus on. But first, she had to get some food and then think of another way to convince Parenti. He threw away her clothes. What a pervert. She'd known he'd be difficult to deal with, but she'd never expected him to be so crazy. It didn't look like Giulio Parenti was ready to accept her offer, so she met with Lorenzo and apologized. There must be some way to win him over. With luck, some information could be extracted from the man. The girl promised to be a model hostage, but she shouldn't expect much. Who was she anyway? Lorenzo turned on the microphone when Hana Lee admitted that she used to be in the special forces and was now unemployed. Sei was just talking about it. It was a girl that Hana Lee looked a lot like in appearance. A plate full of food appeared in front of the protagonist. As it turned out, Lorenzo was an excellent cook. It was his hobby, but Hana Lee thought at first that he used to be a chef. He liked her reaction, though it was indeed as if there was a bright glow coming from the food. She was going to eat it all right now. A doubt settled in her mind as she had previously thought the man was a typical thug, but she had to admit that Lorenzo surprised her. Oh, and the food was so delicious that Hana Lee had tears flowing. It was this moment that she decided to take advantage of. The bandit softened and the protagonist asked who Sei was, the girl he was talking about earlier. Her name sounded Korean, and so it occurred to her that she might have been part of the mafia too. Or there was also the possibility that Sei was Giulio's mistress. Lorenzo resented her speculation, and therefore decided to reveal the secret. It wasn't like a secret though, since she was just being their coworker. That was all. However, Hana Lee was forbidden to say that name in the presence of Giulio. Moreover, she had to try hard not to upset him and be gentle with him. The protagonist watched his reaction carefully, but did not ask the question she was interested in, but only made a promise to try harder. To end the conversation, she shoved a juicy, large piece of meat into her mouth, mulling over Lorenzo's words. But it was definitely clear that something had happened between Giulio and Sei, and that only fueled her curiosity. The guys had struck up a conversation about the brother Hana Lee was looking for, and luckily, Lorenzo knew something. He explained to her that Parenti wasn't the type to take people hostage, because it caused a lot of trouble. It would have been much easier to just kill them. But about the imposter, if he wanted to, they'd have to chase everything, and that would rabble down until the end of time. There were so many of them that Hana Lee was bound to come across at least one just by going outside. That gave her one thought. It turned out that Giulio didn't need the protagonist to catch that guy. Then was he only pretending to be interested in her? Since intelligence believes that they have proof that Dewey is a traitor, Hana Lee has to stay here until she finds something that proves otherwise. She leaned back in her chair, wondering what his plan was. Lorenzo led the way and suddenly made the assumption that the girl was not FBI, Hana Lee guffawed, saying that he rasped that way because of her beauty. He was clearly uncomfortable with her sense of humor, though she wished the man had asked something else. Suddenly they were interrupted. Giulio noticed how close these guys had gotten, and even asked how their date had gone. He grinned, trying to hurt their feelings. Lorenzo, however, had fallen for his bait. The bandit was incoherently trying to prove that the woman had tried to kill him, as if everyone had forgotten about it. She wasn't his type at all, because he liked stunning blondes who had something to hold on to. So Lorenzo wasn't her type either, but Giulio he seemed to undress her tiny figure with his gaze until he asked her to change, mentioning that there were clothes for her in the bedroom. Although Hana Lee was already used to this shirt, besides the bandits had thrown out her clothes themselves. Did they buy new ones? Parenti made a disgruntled grimace, announcing that this shirt was not suitable for the place they were going to. Even Lorenzo realized that the preparations were complete, except that the protagonist was perplexed, looking at them silently. As it turned out, they were going to a funeral. It was raining heavily that day. They found the body of their colleague who died in Cambodia, and even held a small service in his memory. Everyone had a flower in their hand, and they all said their goodbyes, looking toward the departing hearse carrying the coffin. Some managed to hold back tears, while others were overcome by emotion. And Hana Lee said in Korean that she prayed for the repose of the deceased soul. That's what they used to say at funerals. Koreans say words of hope that the deceased will be free and happy after death. Giulio didn't ask any unnecessary questions, but asked to talk after the ceremony. He wished to finish their conversation yesterday. There was only one thing that mattered right now. Hana Lee had to make sure that Giulio Parenti's interest in her didn't fade. She had to stay focused and alert. But she was well aware that the man didn't trust her yet. In fact, that was what the protagonist had asked him about. Now it was his turn. She let him ask the questions she would try to answer. And that idea appealed to him. The man rested his head on his arm lock and was curious about her present endeavor. What did she want from him? She had a whole wish list, however, which Parenti asked to be reduced to 3 items. But in that case, Hana Lee wanted a guarantee to fulfill one of them. Giulio explained that it all depended on exactly what she said. After a brief pause, the protagonist revealed all the cards. First, she wanted the bandit to help her find her brother. Second, she needed resources to find whoever had framed him. And third, Parenti had forgotten about her plate. It seems that the food that Lorenzo had prepared was not enough, which made Hana Lee blush. The man directed everyone to leave them alone, and no one dared to disobey him. The servants marched up the stairs, leaving the 2 of them to enjoy each other's company. The bandit silently handed her his food, but Hana thanked him, still thinking about how she could pocket the knife, which she could suddenly use. The man stood up abruptly. The more he thought about it, the more amusing the situation seemed to him. The silence was broken by his heavy footsteps. He knew absolutely nothing about her. However, he had a very talented intelligence officer working for him, and even he couldn't dig up anything on her. Parenti just thought he should warn her. Suddenly the bandit grabbed her by the neck and declared that taming wild and dangerous animals like her was sort of his hobby. And in that sense, Hana Lee was very interesting to him. Except according to her thoughts, Giulio was a whacked-out psycho who turned out to be even crazier than she thought. She needed to know what this guy was doing when the beast was finally tamed. Was he really killing him in cold blood? The man glared at her and replied that she hadn't guessed. The bandit did it exclusively to those who only pretended to be tame. As soon as he realized he was being lied to, he would immediately start imagining how he would punish his pet. And there were quite a few different ways of doing it. Well, they'd cleared that up. But what would the man say about the hand on her neck? His gaze grew sterner, and then he mouthed the name Gavin Smith. As it turned out, they found his bag not far from the scene of the collision. Inside was a video of the man, caught on camera with the protagonist's brother before the bomb went off. That was why the bandit wanted to know if her guest had seen the video. Hana Lee remained silent while he held her down. What kind of relationship did she have with him? Mentally, the protagonist pondered about that man. If she recalled, there really was a guy next to Dewey. He, with a limp, was following him. Her younger brother was the only person with an explosive device, so Hana Lee assumed that man was just an informant. So it was Smith, Gavin Smith, former FBI agent. And yes, Giulio Parenti already knew that he was one of the FBI's top agents, and someone who had been sinking his teeth into him for a very long time. This guy had once forced a gangster to start a war with the Red Mafia, causing New York City to descend into utter chaos. Thus, Smith wanted to get rid of him. But then he suddenly quit the FBI and was never seen again. At least not until this Dewey videos. Giulio Parenti began to squeeze his hand harder, causing the protagonist to shake. Her hand gradually moved closer to the knife, at the same time asking why this man would want to frame her brother. The interlocutor asked not to break the comedy. He had enemies everywhere, he couldn't even trust God. And her brother was somehow connected to a man who had bet his whole life on getting revenge on the bandits. Did Hana Lee really think he would trust her? His gaze sizzled over her immobilized body, so she still wanted him to help find Dewey, who was being sawed next to his worst enemy. Except the protagonist realized that he was using her little brother. It was obvious that he was endangered. If Dewey was caught by the FBI, she could not waste another second. She finally managed to intercept the knife and free herself from his grasp. Except that a small scratch showered the man's neck with drops of blood. Just as he cared for his family, she would do anything to save her brother. Dewey, I would never betray his agency. She didn't care what others said. Parenti mumbled that Hana Lee was under suspicion of him, not her Dewey, except she didn't work for the FBI, not that he would take her word for it. And the truth was, the protagonist wasn't one of them. A stranger whose identity he couldn't even identify, which was exactly why she had decided to come forward. Her real name was Lee Hana. The girl was a mercenary from Valentine's Day, First was her call sign. However, the man didn't even know what it meant. She wished she was an FBI agent or something, because that way the situation wouldn't get out of hand. Parenti had stopped her. The more he learned, the more she turned on him. It was getting harder and harder to restrain herself, but the man grabbed her again and kissed her forcefully. Initially, Hana Lee was afraid of doing something wrong, except that didn't stop her from using the knife. But even so, this psycho was asking to stick it deeper. Now it seemed like his desire was growing with every second he spent with her. Hana Lee demanded an end to this nonsense and pushed the man away. She wasn't here to kill him after all. Eventually, she was put in handcuffs, and when asked to let her go, Giulio refused. He lounged on the couch while the doctor examined the knife wound. The girl even threatened that she could get rid of them if she wanted to. However, the bandit played along with her, agreeing, but he thought it would be in her best interest not to do it. Parenti strained a smile as he prepared to say that he would not voice aloud what he would do to her if the protagonist escaped. He didn't even blink an eye. Hana Lee's plans were going down the drain. She had originally thought that Giulio was a common mobster, and she could easily play on his desire for revenge. Even though it was risky, the girl still thought that she would be able to pull it off. But in all likelihood, she miscalculated somewhere. Hana Lee called out to the man, saying something about Gavin Smith. That's how she got his attention. She wondered if Parenti knew how to find him. She was sure she could track this guy down, as she set her mind to it. Moreover, for what reason did Smith want Giulio dead? The bandit silently cast a long look at her, scratching his shoulder. The reason was that Parenti had killed his younger brother. Hana Lee jumped up angrily from her chair, causing the guards to swarm around her, as she mentally told herself not to give in to his provocations because this trickster was just testing her. In that case, when was he planning to release her? With a relaxed gait, Giulio headed for the shirt, mouthing the words according to which he would do so when he realized she could be trusted. Until then, Hana Lee would be his hostage. However, this arrangement was not to her liking. But then the protagonist will be just a prisoner from which the man can get rid of at any time. However, she will not just sit here. First, she has to deal with these ambassadors, who did not look so strong, so knocking them out is a task of a couple of seconds. And then, if she managed to jump out that window, suddenly another opponent appeared behind her. He, like a ghost, got close to her and forbade her to even think about it. The guy directed her to go back to her room, and explained that they would treat her with respect as long as Hana Lee was honest with them. She basically had nothing to say. But Giulio Parenti was enjoying her frightened look as evidenced by his baying laughter. This made the protagonist blush with embarrassment. She wanted to kill everyone here now and ride off into the sunset. After a while, the man looked at her personal belongings. Of course he had heard of her. This girl is a legendary agent. When Giulio first looked into her eyes, he thought the angel of death himself had come for him. And when he saw her bloody face and wild gaze, he felt a sense of freedom so unfamiliar to him. Perhaps then the bandit wanted her to pull the trigger. The man called out to the employee what was written here. The guy assumed it was about Kang Moojin. Moreover, Parenti gave the task to find Logan Valentine's number for him, since they were searching for information. He had no idea that Hana Lee worked for this man, causing fear and surprise mixed together to close in on his face. Now it was clear why she'd been stressing him out. Now they would have a lot of people to find, and even more to kill. Meanwhile, the protagonist waited meekly, dressed in the clothes Lorenzo had found for her. She resented it because the bandits didn't even try to pretend to listen to her when she talked about escaping. Also, strangely enough, no one came to her cries, and so it went on all day, but here was a disaster. She had to go to the ladies' room. Giulio opened the door at that moment. Hana Lee found it funny because it was high time she was uncuffed. He wasn't laughing though. The bandit kept teasing her, asking how she'd rested, but he knew she couldn't have done it in those shackles. She wasn't going to escape. All she needed was to free herself to go to the bathroom. Parenti stepped closer to her and put her hands behind her head, as if he couldn't hear what she was saying. The protagonist couldn't stand it anymore. The man, on the other hand, scrutinized her shaking body and the way she was pleading with him. His breathing became heavy, for the protagonist was literally driving him crazy, but his hand brazenly pulled at the lower part of her body. Eventually he left the handcuffs on, but buckled them back on. Hana Lee came back into the room with an exhale, declaring that if he had taken off her pants himself, he would have to put them back on. The man asked if she had washed her hands. As if to mock her, how would Hana Lee do it if her hands were behind her back? But in his opinion, that was something that could be easily fixed. Parenti pinned her with his body in the sink, and did it himself. She couldn't believe she was in this position. Her face became more and more red, until the man squeezed her hands. He seemed to want to take care of other parts of her body. The girl shivered, knowing that he was horny, but do your own thing up like that was a total bore. Giulio realized that she needed a more subtle approach to her. Hana Lee, on the other hand, declared no matter how hard he tried, she wasn't going to do anything like that to him because she cared about her life. But aren't those supposed to be his words? Actually, it was the protagonist who ducked his knife during the kiss. She reasoned that this behavior was because the man was trying to strangle her, as if he didn't see the bruises on her neck. The bandit strained a satisfied smile, scrutinizing her body until he summarized that they looked good on her. Really crazy. Hana Lee didn't listen to him any further and broke free of his grip, leaving him to stare after her. Except he had something else in mind. The man grabbed her cuffed hands and threw her on the bed, and then he hovered over her, demanding that she be a good girl, because he would give her a gift. And that's a cell phone. Due must have texted her. That's why she was so nervous, even though she was told to behave like a good girl. Giulio decided to play with her and put the phone in his pocket, which made the girl jump up, knowing she would do anything to get it. She kissed him and wrapped her legs around his waist. This was her chance. Eventually, the protagonist rolled Parenti over and sat on top of him, causing the thug to even snatch his phone. There was only a little bit left, and you could even try to do it with your mouth. But Giulio found a use for it too. He grabbed her head and kissed her until the girl bit him. Hana Lee exclaimed that he could have saved that for his girls. His eyes held anger, for after all, the girl turned out to be just like her. The protagonist didn't realize who he was talking about, but the bandit indicated for her to get dressed and follow him. They had guests. These were the people who could give her the gift of freedom. Now she had even more questions. Hana Lee stopped the thug, demanding that he let her look at her phone for at least a second because she needed to see what the message was. But Giulio was convinced she owed him because he returned the phone and even threatened to give the toy back. The main character was angry, which made her look even cuter in his eyes. She had all her thoughts written all over her face. Fortunately, she changed her mood quickly and wondered if they really had to greet the guests like that. Meanwhile, the couple was moving around in slippers. Not even Parenti would have thought it looked weird. If people saw them like this, they would definitely get it all wrong. And here they are. There were 3 people sitting in the hall who were shocked by the girl's appearance. In fact, the same could be said about her. However, one detail was confusing. Giulio and Hana Lee's hands were handcuffed. Now the protagonist could only sigh because they were all definitely thinking about the wrong thing. Suddenly she was called over by Eunseong. The guy in Korean motioned for her to sit closer to him, but he didn't take into account one fact. The girl was related to the bandit. Right now she was an inmate. Giulio, however, smiled broadly, explaining that it was a necessary security measure. If he left her unattended, it could put his subordinates in mortal danger. However, no one was surprised by this. Hana Lee asked what they were all doing here. As it turned out, Mr. Parenti had contacted them yesterday, though they were more interested in knowing how she was doing. The protagonist called her debut, a small fight, but everything was fine. Oh, and she also jumped him with a dinner knife in the shoulder. Her openness was probably what the thug liked, because even now he was smiling. Well, it was time to cut to the chase. The man wished to ask a couple of questions. According to the first, he was curious if his guest was really the agent known by the call sign one. Logan was nervous, as he did not know his true motives. Meister Valentine lowered his gaze down and pondered whether or not this information was worth sharing. The man said that things were different now. There were times when she operated under that name. That is, Hana Lee was not working for the FBI. Then Giulio's gaze fell on Eunseong. The female protagonist entered the dialogue, but he didn't hear her because his head was busy thinking about the one task he wanted to assign Valentine's Day. He needed someone to guard Hana Lee. A girl didn't understand what was being talked about, but she was interrupted by Eunseong, who offered his candidacy, if he was allowed to, of course, especially since the guys had already gotten close in that hut. The girl objected that there was no such thing, and even snatched the drink from Parenti. It was her business, and she would not tolerate interference from the others. The bandit took her hand, drinking the contents after all. Hana Lee showed her temper and smashed the glass against the wall, which Logan had apparently anticipated. It was for this obvious reason that Giulio Parenti didn't want his men guarding her. Even gangsters valued their lives. Well, Eunseong was hired after all, and the gangster even poured him a drink. Friggai himself was casting glances at the relationship between the two, especially when that cocky guy purposely took the protagonist's hand, and he also made such a face. By evening, Hana Lee had been freed from her shackles and even had her belongings returned to her. Giulio warned her that if she didn't want to be shackled again, she had better behave herself and obey her guards. How he had pissed her off. Now she tried to calm herself down and checked her phone, expecting a message from Dewey, but it turned out to be a picture of her brother's leg. It was like the guy wanted to show her the gender. Hana Lee scrutinized the photo, noticing the unusual cover, and its ornamentation said that it could be Muin's shipping company. That was exactly what Eunseong had suggested. Did he really think he could barge in on her whenever he wanted, just because Parenti had appointed him bodyguard? The guy was banging on though. He saw her concentration actually, which was what she decided to take advantage of. The protagonist asked as Eunseong realized it was Muin's company by only glancing at the floor. But he explained that he wasn't looking there. He was looking at the trademark. How did the guy see it? And if this photo isn't a montage, Dewey is probably on a ship right now. The company is run by a man named Kang Moojin. Anyway, Hana Lee made it out of that mess alive. And of course Eunseong wanted to keep it that way. But he wasn't sure about that since Parenti had his eye on her. Someone like her is like a trigger for him. Now the protagonist was curious about what he was talking about. There seemed to be a lot she didn't know about him yet. Giulio Parenti was the eldest son and had once been a member of Guys. At the moment, this guy runs the whole business from his mansion in Sicily. Ever since the terrorist incident in Chicago gained widespread public attention, he has been in the business of supplying only legal drugs made for medical use. And Giulio has a special weakness for women with black hair. Apparently, it has something to do with his mother and also the reason for his conflict with the Red Mafia. The Asian woman who married the Russian ringleader is Parenti's former lover, and her name is Sei Jang. In general, Hana Lee looked a lot like her, and that made her load up for a long time. She remembered Lorenzo's words and the bandit himself. It was getting more and more interesting. Now the protagonist could use this in the future. In that case, she might as well listen further. Eunseong dug up some information. Hana Lee came running to Parenti after a while, saying that she heard about his invitation to one of the yachts that Muin owns. So what did she do to her bodyguard? All she did was to get away from him. The girl didn't come here for him to cause unnecessary trouble because she wanted to go with him. Eunseong told her that the CEO of this company, Kang Moojin himself, would be at this party. And right now, Dewey was stalking this man. He may have many reasons for this, but probably one of them is that Kang Moojin might be the person who is impersonating Giulio. Hana Lee told the thug that she needed to meet Kang Moojin IL, to which the man asked not to make him laugh. It wasn't an event where someone like her could show up. Except that the girl kept pushing him. She knew who the imposter was, and she wanted to catch him for him. Parenti replied that it didn't interest him. Did he change his mind? Hana Lee assumed that he found her offer attractive to him. But in fact, he already knew who he was pretending to be. All this time, the gangster had kept this secret to himself. I should come as no surprise to her that the great Sicilian mafia boss didn't just sit on the sidelines. But then why hadn't he told her about it? The man gave her a blank stare, answering that she'd been wrong to make herself think he'd report to her. And rightly so. Hana Lee didn't expect more from him. It was almost as if she had to trust him. The more the protagonist thought about it, the more she started to get angry. She was speaking Korean the whole time, so Giulio asked her to switch to English. But she continued in her native language to resent him. How long did he even plan to lead her around for? Was this really some kind of revenge for Hana Lee jumping him with a knife? When asked to switch to English, she replied that she didn't want to. Why did the protagonist have to obey him? All of a sudden, what's more, now she was asking him to stop courtling in Italian. Parenti thought the guest was overexcited. But there was anger coming over her. The girl said the same thing about him, grabbing his head, threatening that if that man even touched her little brother with a finger, she would finish the go, but only after she had dealt with Giulio Parenti. Because he was the reason I was in this mess in the first place. She shoved him insolently, demanding that the man get out of her sight. Though he didn't like the idea, the bandit managed to grab her arm and drag her behind him into the pool. Underwater, while she was mentally cursing at him, Parenti lifted her by the chin and kissed her. Hana Lee couldn't understand the reason why he kept acting like this. It was like he was trying to get rid of his depression over his ex with her help. The main character closed her eyes and her body relaxed. Giulio got scared and lifted her to the surface, startled. The joke worked, judging by the look on the man's face. He suddenly looked so upset. In his opinion, she was out of line and it wasn't funny. Although those were supposed to be her words. The girl had even suggested he see a psychiatrist because he was mistaking her for someone else. Giulio covered his eyes and mumbled that Hana Lee was wrong for saying that, because now he could see how he and she were nothing alike. In that case, the protagonist wanted to know why the man was acting like an abandoned dog. Just in time, Eunseong showed up. Suddenly, the bandit put his arms around Hana Lee's waist, asking her to pretend to be him. In that case, she could do whatever she wanted. The bodyguard reached out, not believing that the girl had escaped from him, citing a change of clothes. He even managed to miss her. It was the same thing every time. Her fragile hand reached for his, but Parenti deliberately stopped her, asking if she really wanted to go to the party with him. There weren't many people in this world who would dare to touch his woman. He said that and looked at Eunseong contemptuously. Except that the protagonist was surprised that Giulio agreed to take her with him to the yacht. Except that he would do it on one condition. He didn't need help. From his face did not fly off a sly smile, as if he was playing a play. The man pretended that something suddenly made him feel bad, and it was his intimacy with Hana Lee that pissed off her bodyguard. The girl saw nothing suspicious, and made the assumption that he was ill. Could the great and terrible mob boss have caught a cold? Parenti returned his eyes to the newcomer, who had quietly gone inside. They will be going out in public together tomorrow, so Hana Lee should be ready. If he understood her correctly, the protagonist wanted to go to a very elite party with him. So he had bad news for her. She was definitely not going to get there looking like that. Well, it seems he got there, because the girl loved shopping and was eager to go to almost every store. Parenti, on the other hand, was excited. Although just 10 minutes ago, this woman was talking about going to the first store she could find, because she would wear this outfit only once anyway, so she didn't want to make a fashion judgment. What a good girl Hana Lee was. So now she was pretending, like she understood why the man was frowning, and telling the counselor that these bigwigs wouldn't be here long. The protagonist pointed to the skirt and top. Picking out clothes was an easy task. All she needed was for the outfit to conceal the weapon and allow easy access to it. Now Giulio thought it would be easier for her to go naked, and she wondered when he would be willing to share his naturally unsolicited opinion. Hana Lee explained, though the thug could also see that she had a stunning body, so she would look great in anything. She didn't have to worry about that. She certainly had no shortage of self-love. But the protagonist did not heed her ardor, and now the shoes caught her eye. But Giulio Parenti only sighed heavily and paid for her. He led her quickly out of the store, even as she yelled about not being done with her shopping yet, though the bodyguards wouldn't say so. The man still insisted that Hana Lee would not go to the party, then also what she would go there in. Though there was nothing to worry about, she looked gorgeous in whatever clothes she wore. To him, it sounded like a mockery. Suddenly, the girl ran forward, glancing back at him slightly and offering him a cup of coffee. Something thumped in his heart, but he managed to pull himself together and ask for an espresso. Giulio Parenti took her hand, causing her to scrutinize his stony reaction. Hana knew it looked like a couple of lovers on a joyride, but now the man was watching her closely. And she should definitely take advantage of this opportunity, because she needed this guy. To be exact, she needed his name. The couple secluded themselves in a quiet place, and Giulio had long ago noticed that Hana wasn't afraid of him at all. Should she be? She was far more afraid of the head teacher of the orphanage than she was of him. Apparently, he didn't know the story, as the protagonist might have assumed. But the bandit was aware that their parents had died when she and her brother were still children. And that was true. They never had them, since the boys were born in a motel. Hana assumed that their birth mother just couldn't bring herself to kill her unwanted children, so she left them there and ran away. Probably from that moment on, her brother became the most precious thing about her. He is her whole life. It was so different from the relationships. In a man's family, they always try to take every opportunity to get rid of a rival brother or sister. Giulio stood up from the table as the preparations were completed. It was about clothes, shoes, and accessories. All of this is already waiting at the villa. Hana wondered, not realizing what they had been doing here all day, except Parenti hadn't said they were going shopping. He had just specified that it was forbidden to show up at this party looking like that. It was fun for him to follow her around, plus he needed some fresh air. Oh, and Hana Lee was having fun tonight. Her confused reaction made him smile. Eunseong spoke on the phone, relaying to the person on the other end that everything was going according to plan for them. Fortunately, things had gone as well on the other side. Now the guy could start preparing to return to Korea, for he had done quite a bit in Cambodia. The operation the man had planned was a little more extensive than he had intended. In addition, the guy Eunseong was working with had done a few things here. He pretended to be Parenti. It was useless. He wondered if the protagonist had returned that cell phone, because it looked like Hana could use it to track Dewey's whereabouts. Suddenly, someone's voice sounded behind his back. For some reason, she couldn't tell if he was just waiting for her to return or if he was waiting for the right moment to stab her in the back. Eunseong's implication was obvious. He was just waiting for the protagonist to interrupt his loneliness. Hana pushed his cocky limb away when the man inquired about how her date went. He was curious if she was interested in the gangster. The girl glared at him, looking into his reflection and wanting to know why he was asking. Could it be that Parenti was his target? And that was why Eunseong had volunteered to guard her. Even though the guy said he was just worried about her because the girl had a nasty habit of running ahead without thinking about anything. She was not comfortable with it. Why did he even care? What was happening to her? The guy had already said he was interested in her romantically, if she still didn't get it. If she needed an assistant, however, she should have looked around. Wouldn't it be better to work with a mercenary like her rather than these unreliable thugs? Eunseong seemed to think they were better, and the mafia, and here they were shooting, killing, stealing, and cheating people. How were they any different from them? Still, the man insisted that there was a difference because at least they didn't treat people as trophies. Parenti, in his opinion, was an amateur, a cheap fake. As soon as he had tamed the protagonist, he would immediately dispose of her like a piece of trash and not even raise an eyebrow. Her brother was betrayed by his own agency, and he may have betrayed them in return, which means no one's even trying to save him right now. So who was Hana supposed to ask for help from? Should she trust the government or should she trust him? The more she got to know Eunseong, the more convinced she became that he knew too much about this case. Like the shipping company, for example. Except the guy couldn't just tell her everything. It's pretty valuable information, after all, so he wanted to get something in return. Hana agreed to keep him alive, but only this time. If she caught him rummaging through her things one more time, she'd finish him off in a heartbeat. He shouldn't even have thought he could touch the phone, because now she didn't trust him one bit. Giulio told her that he wanted to eat together, so the three of them gathered for dinner under the night sky. The atmosphere was horribly disgusting, and she even felt like the bandit might have poisoned their food. So she asked if he had people checking the food, just like kings. Eunseong directly asked what the gangster wanted to talk about, and there were doubts that he just wanted to enjoy a meal together. True, careful, Thompson. They would have to be done with everything, but for that they would have to travel to Macau. Hana objected to this and even got up from the table. He seemed to have forgotten why she had come to Cambodia. Her face was even turning red with anger. However, Giulio Parenti only took a deep exhale, calming both himself and himself. It was about a cruise ship that left Cambodia and went straight to Macau. That's actually how the party he'd been invited to was going. And the ship sailed 2 weeks ago. Eunseong has been silently listening to them all this time, as if he was hiding something. But the protagonist would never have thought that the liner would leave the country. Fortunately, Giulio was planning to return to Italy after he finished with all the business here. So he wasn't going back to Cambodia, so this was probably their last dinner together. It was the kind of thing he wanted to drink for. Hana Lee had already prepared herself by hiding herself in a black suit, and Eunseong was worried if she could handle it alone, wanting to go with her. The girl believed in the best and promised not to stay there for long. She announced that if she didn't show up in 10 minutes, it was safe to assume that both Lorenzo and Eunseong would have to go after her personally. And now it was time to begin. Before the protagonist left Cambodia, she needed to draw a line and end everything that had happened here. The fact that Dewey had managed to hide so well said one thing. Someone had helped him with it. In fact, he might have teamed up with someone to secretly investigate to get to the bottom of everything related to Parenti and Kang Mujin. There was only one thing left for Hana to check out. At this time, a certain someone was talking to someone on the phone, explaining that he had started having serious health problems that made him want to return to Korea and get checked out. At this rate, the man would go to his maker much sooner than he would like, and permission was granted. Now all he had to do was wait to be sent to Korea, and it was done. Except that while he was thinking up an escape plan, he was discovered by Hana. She asked, already knowing that the guy wanted to escape, trying to get out of here quietly. Gradually, the protagonist began to get out of the darkness, but the man went inside, looking for something. By the way, this thing turned out to be in her hands. Hana saw how nervous Tae-jeon was, and how he acted as if he had made a big mistake. But shouldn't she be the one feeling guilty because she attacked him sneakily a few days ago? He didn't blame her for anything though, because she didn't know that her little brother was alive. In that case, that was the reason why Tae-jeon didn't report it to his superiors. They didn't seem to be aware of what had happened. He was scared shitless, so he asked her to put the gun down and have a calm discussion afterward. But how long was the guy going to lead her on? Tae-jeon was really hiding something after all, and his reaction was telling of that. Dewey had nothing to do with Parenti, and what he said about the bandit who killed him was nonsense. The man's body began to shake, but he continued to pretend as if he didn't understand anything. Moreover, he had a question as to how Hana could be so sure of that, because she knew what was an imposter. It was Kang Mujin, the director of Muan Shipping Company. Hana decided to give Tae-jeon one last chance to think it over carefully and answer her question correctly. Was he the one who betrayed Dewey? The phrase made his eyes spin, his skin sweat, and the words came out of his mouth. The man exclaimed that he had not betrayed him, but Dewey was the one who had turned his back on them. A gunshot was heard. Thankfully, the bullet flew through the window pane, but Tae-jeon never got rid of his habit of scratching his neck when he lied. Well, he made his choice. Now he had to hurry up and get out of here as fast as possible, because the next time Hana took a shot with that gun, he definitely wouldn't miss. In other words, he wasn't going to let himself get caught. The guests appeared outside the door, and Tae-jeon didn't realize what they were waiting for. The door opened, and the command to catch the girl was heard. Hana remained calm until the end. After all, she had some advantage in her hand. The shots were heard by Lorenzo and Eunseong, but Tae-jeon rushed away with one last glance at the bloody glass. The bodyguard kicked in the door when he saw Hana, who was sitting against the wall with her head bowed. She took a greedy gulp of air and mumbled that he was late. Giulio Parenti was talking to someone on the phone, asking if the pictures had been sent to him. The man on the other side tried to find out something about Kong Mujin, but strangely enough, he couldn't find any useful information. Some things though, this was the best he had managed to get. The company had apparently tried their best to hide even the most low-quality photos of him, and the man had also learned that a few years ago, this guy wasn't even listed as the Moon Company's heir. And then his half-brother Kang Moo-ho had suddenly retired and Kang Moo-jin had taken his place. Speaking of that party, he was invited there too. He thought it was a kind of PR, it was either that or business. Giulio didn't like it, so his interlocutor had to be there. He said the same thing about him. By the way, the man had heard that his buddy had found a rather unusual accessory for himself. It was about the mercenary from Valentine's Day whose name was Hana. He should have been careful since this woman had put Cyril in the hospital for an entire month, and Carlo had nearly slit his throat. Oh, and it didn't take a professional to deal with his right-hand man and brother. There was nothing to worry about because right now the guys were doing one thing. Someone knocked on the door, but Giulio heard that it would be a bad idea to appear in public together, especially at this party. The man turned off his phone just as outside Lorenzo was giving orders to find a doctor faster. He was carrying the protagonist on one shoulder, whose screams were giving her a headache. It pissed him off that she kept making jokes. She urgently needed a blood transfusion. Giulio Parenti was watching from the second floor, but his nervously clenched hands and hunched body spoke of his anger. The protagonist had her own suspicions. She couldn't leave Cambodia without checking things out properly. But now Hana couldn't believe that Taejun had really betrayed Dewey, or that the guy had just run away from the guards. Either way, it could have been different if he had told her honestly and immediately. At that moment, Giulio entered the room with a first aid kit. He reminded her that the heroine had said to give her an hour to go on business. He wondered if staining his house with blood was also part of her plan. The girl asked him to put everything on the table and leave, for she was unnerved by his presence. Parenti opened the syringe with her mouth and began to draw on the medication while she hoped it wasn't a sedative. The man was going to inject her with a local anesthetic. Silence hung in the room for a couple seconds. Giulio broke it by saying that she was as red-blooded as everyone else. Did he think she was a monster? The bandit didn't want Hana prancing around him, with other men's marks on her body. Her cheeks turned pink and she quickly changed the subject, suggesting that all those guys were probably already dead. But did that change anything? Parenti decided to clarify the fact that all the creeps who had done this to her had already met their end, and it made him even angrier. The protagonist wanted to tease him a little, so Hana asked if he would like her to smell just like him. His hand even twitched. The man loomed over her, putting his finger in her mouth. He was going to help her find her brother in Macau, so no need to play around with him. Also, as soon as she found Dewey, she would go straight back to Korea with him. Now that Taejun had betrayed her and escaped, all she had left was Giulio Parenti. Her face flashed with heat and her lips reached up to kiss him. The man who had almost strangled her was now worried that she would be hurt. She would take full advantage of him from now on. And the only question was, would this guy prove to be her lifeline or a rotten rope that would lead to her demise? Taejun was nervously packing his things because he wasn't going to stay here a second longer. As soon as he got back to Korea, he'd make some excuse and he wasn't allowed to finish by the uninvited guest, who scared him away by turning on the lights. Something strange was going on, because even all the computers were on. Could it be that someone had bypassed their security system? That was something not every professional could do. But how did they get in without disabling the alarm system? A gun came to hand. The atmosphere became more and more tense, especially when someone's footsteps were heard. The man advised Taejun not to even think about running away, because the more he fidgeted, the sicker their dialogue would get for him. Giulio Parenti decided to strike back. He'd heard the guy was hanging around, impersonating him. Of course, Taejun denied it, but all the evidence said otherwise. The man knew who it was and could explain, so he tried to calm the thug down, but the bullet was faster. The guy went down, wounded in the leg. That was for framing Giulio Parenti. And this, because he was in an ascending mood today. The main character woke up as if she felt something. Next to her was Eunseong, who still continued to break in on her in a cheeky manner. The guy figured she'd be in pain when the anesthesia wore off, after all. He was her bodyguard, and it was his job to protect her. His hand touched her thigh where the wound was. There was nothing to worry about because she was already taken care of. Parenti wasn't bad enough that even a doctor didn't need to be called. Right now she was thirsty. But Eunseong continued to bestow her with a warm gaze. He couldn't believe that Hana really liked Giulio Parenti. The protagonist didn't hear and asked again, but he decided not to repeat himself. Logan called when she was asleep. He said that Valentine's Day would put a bodyguard on Kang Moojin for the duration of the party. Eunseong assumed that was why Logan had come to Cambodia. The man was his client after all, so all the protagonist has to do is find Oslo at this party. The Asian man standing next to him will be Kang Moojin. In Macau, a girl with gorgeous hair was primping herself at the mirror. A man appeared behind her back and kissed her from behind. Giulio Parenti was overacting after all. He didn't even see anything forbidden about it. At last they were ready, and it looked like they would actually be sharing a room. It didn't seem like a good idea. The man confirmed her speculation because, as much as she was pretending to be his woman, they would be watched. The protagonist asked him to help her with the lightning, from which Giulio at first stood in a stupor, but, pulling himself together, kissed her back. Hana exclaimed that they didn't have time for that, especially since it was past time for them to go to the party, though the man wouldn't say he wanted to go anywhere. But if they had to, he was at least planning to get her well aroused, so that all eyes at the event would be on her alone. Giulio kissed her greedily, which seemed to make the air in the whole room lacking. In a game like this, the person who naively thinks they have the advantage always makes the first move. Kang Moojin would be looking for them himself or something. This was not how Hana Lee had envisioned it all, since that night Giulio had become much more outspoken in his actions. It was like he didn't need to size her up anymore. Should the protagonist play along with him? She didn't think it was the worst possible scenario right now. If he kept getting this excited, he'd let his guard down sooner or later. But they were interrupted by someone knocking on the door. Finally, the gear had arrived, which she could really use. It was a huge box, which Hana peered inside questioningly. There was a bracelet containing a sedative, a necklace that had a small bomb embedded in it, and a hair clip that could easily be used to stab a person. And that jewelry suited her perfectly. About the liner, they would have to sail on today. Giulio had said it was still on its way. She thought she had seen it docked a little earlier. As it turned out, it was a fake ship. There's going to be a party on it tonight. Parenti held out his hand to her, inviting her to move out. Hana accepted his invitation, taking the man under her arm. Bright fireworks lit up the night sky. Under their light appeared the figures of Giulio and the protagonist, who was wounded to appear where her brother was. To be precise, in the place where Dewey was waiting for her. Even if it suddenly turned out that her brother wasn't here, he would most likely be on that cruise ship. Oh, and the party was much bigger than she had expected. Everyone was just staring at the couple. Something about her couldn't keep a nonchalant expression on her face. Giulio joked that they were only staring because Hana looked incredibly beautiful when she was horny. She denied it though. But then why were her ears and neck so nicely flushed? Suddenly someone called out to the bandit. The girl looking up at him from below didn't expect to meet him here. The woman was the wife of a red mob gangster, and Dai Yiyo's former lover. Her name was Sai Jang. It turns out that the man next to her is Yuri Petrov, a member of the Red Mafia and the chief financial officer of the Petrov Corporation. I was finally pleased to meet the protagonist, which took her by surprise. The bandit had pinned her down when Hana Lee decided to be respectful, though she hoped Giulio hadn't arranged it for his ex. Though how did she envision that? But did Parenti have a better explanation? Suddenly, the protagonist noticed a familiar face that she clearly didn't want to see. It was Cyril Kuzmin, It was necessary to meet him here out of all possible places. She hadn't seen this guy, since she'd given him a good thrashing a couple years ago, and how could Hana in charge forget that he was Petrov's right-hand man? Suddenly Seo-jang spoke in Korean, recognizing that her new acquaintance was her compatriot. She reiterated that it was a pleasure to meet her, even adding that Hana just looked great. Giulio suggested that Yuri talk, so he ordered the main heroine not to go anywhere, and to wait for him here. Weren't they allowed to look around a bit? Bandit said no because his men hadn't checked the whole ship yet, and Yuri ordered Cyril to keep an eye on Seo while he was gone. At that moment, Eunseong, who had previously helped the others search the ship, appeared behind the protagonist's back. She answered nonchalantly, which was probably why Seo was looking at her so admiringly. The girl took Hana Lee by the hand and suggested going inside, where there was at least air conditioning. A bright smile shone on her face as she didn't care about the serious business the boys were doing. She didn't feel very comfortable being outside. Who knows when a bullet would land in her forehead, since all those tall buildings were the perfect cover for snipers. However, Hana thought that the organizers were in control of that since they had taken over the event. The girls moved through a huge hall that was brightly lit, followed by 2 figures of bodyguards. But every time the protagonist tried to pull away from this intrusive persona, Seo pulled her towards her, smiling broadly. She told her to relax, and just be herself because Kang Moojin would definitely not be here today. She shouldn't have trusted anyone, no matter what they told her, except Seo-jang. As it turned out, the bracelet that Hana Lee was wearing was made for her by her. Basically, the protagonist was aware that the item contained a sedative, but still, her new acquaintance decided to remind her. But if she turned the blue diamond 90 degrees, she would see a capsule containing a simulant. It's kind of like an antidote. Hana Lee will have to inhale it in case she is suddenly drugged by someone with illegal substances. Say, I didn't tell Giulio about this, but she decided to share it with her because she liked the protagonist. She was amazed at her cheerfulness, especially when her compatriot talked about things like this. Seo-jang was really charming, which was probably the reason for the bandit's infatuation with her. Moreover, this woman felt like she was looking at a past version of herself, although Hana thought that they were very different. No argument followed, but one day Giulio's former lover also had to risk her life for her family. She asked to trust her because the Kang Moojin who would show up at the party tonight would turn out to be a fake. The real man was probably watching them from behind some dark place. Like if he sent a fake man in his place, knowing that he would be attacked, then Kang Moojin probably wanted that attack to happen. But all of a sudden, Gavin Smith was in sight. The protagonist sat her friend down, about to call for security. The girl ordered Eunseong to head that way and block all possible escape routes, as their target was the waiter with the red bow tie. Luckily, she managed to rid the bodyguard all the waiters here, including Gavin Smith, wore black ties, so that would buy her some time. Hana Lee rushed out to look for him, but the man disappeared before she could even blink an eye. Suddenly someone hit her, causing her to lose focus for a few seconds. She had no idea how much her opponent was looking forward to this encounter.